government is concerned over how long is your recession where output fall. So what kind of policy should government use if there is inflation? Okay, so there are two types. So let's start off with the economy. Initial inflation is 5%. So we draw the Phillips curve. We are now at A5. Do you see? Inflation, 5%. Okay? Now, this may not be familiar if you have not, I think none of you have studied topic 7, but topic 7 tells us, if I actually assume that, right, I'm also at point A, okay, at A5, I assume my unemployment is also at the natural rate. Then I know my inflation rate is also the expected rate, 5%. So we are back to reading the Phillips curve. So government set a target within 1 year. Okay, so this is deemed as urgent. Right? This is actually a very tall order task. If within 1 year, you want to bring inflation rate down to 3%. So you can see, change in your pi is a -2. Okay, so you apply the sacrifice ratio, a value of 2. If you are strong in maths, you know sacrifice ratio is change in you over change in your pi. Right? Now, actually sacrifice ratio comes with a minus sign. Okay, but the value is 2. But the actual value has a minus because pi and u goes opposite direction. So you can see change in u, in this case, is a -2 times a -2, which is a +4. So if government is keen to bring down inflation from a 5 to a 3%, right, the sacrifice ratio predict within the year, unemployment will add to a 4% to the natural rate. Okay, so why is that so? You are initially at point 1, okay, or step 1. Okay, so if government wants to lower inflation rate, so we know government use contractionary monetary policy, cut back AD, firms have to slow down the increase in prices. Right? Firms cannot sell things as expensive as before. Inflation rate dropped. But pi E is unchanged. So imagine pi drops to 3%. But pi E remains at 5%. It means prices increased by 3%. Wages went up based on pi E, 5%. So therefore, why did unemployment increase? Because real wage went up. That's why labor demand drops, unemployment worsened. So if you choose to use a cold turkey policy, it means you are in a hurry, you urgently want to bring down inflation rate. You have to have a very strong contractionary monetary policy to shrink the AD. Right? But the answer is not just A5 to B. Why was there a trade-off of a +4? Because workers were adaptive. They were not rational at all. They keep thinking inflation is still 5%. They ask for wages to go up 5%. But firms only increase price by 3%. So the firms cannot cope. Look at the ratio. P increased slower. So it's expensive. Unemployment will up. So this is called a cold turkey policy. Within 1 year, pi E don't change yet, but firms have to keep adjusting their price level. Right? Okay? And also the bottom line is, okay, this is only relevant if your UN is very low. Right? Okay? So you can use a cold turkey policy if your UN is low. Like Singapore, 2.2, you add a 4, it becomes 6.2. You cannot apply it to US. US is 6.9. Right? Then You take the 6.9 plus a 4%. It will become 10.9. It's too serious already. So government, alright, they want to pursue disinflation. But whether he wants to do it urgently or not, one of the consideration is the natural rate. If the natural rate is too high, you may not want to do an immediate or a cold turkey policy. The firms will quickly slash the workers. Right? Okay? So this is within 1 year. So we use the same concept, but now we split it into 2 installments. We call it a gradual policy over 2 years. Okay? So we're using very simple model to compare the outcome. So instead of straight away bringing down, okay, inflation by 2%, you reduce it 1% over 2 installments. So you can see change in pi is only -1 each time. Sacrifice ratio is a -2. So change in U is a +2. Right? So because you actually contract the economy slower. Okay? So in this case, you repeat the process. Right? To reduce your pi, you adopt contractionary monetary policy, but you are not having an ambitious goal. Just now you must contract prices or inflation rate by 2%. Now you only halve it. So the same contractionary monetary policy will reduce AD slower. Okay, so that's why pi will drop slower. Okay, right? But however, with pi E constant, pi drops, but slower. W over P still increase, but slower. Just now remember, W was 5%, P was a 3. But now W is 5, P is only 4. Real wage still goes up, but slower. So therefore, labor demand drops, but slower. So unemployment increased to UN plus 2. So you go from A5 to B. So that was the first installment. You still have workers being retrenched because they still ask for 5% wage increase. But workers experience 4% price increase. So the retrenchment is less severe. So A5 go to B. Right? Okay, so I'll show you. Okay, pi drops. Let's put in all the steps. And unemployment increases. So this is your step 1, your first installment of your policy. But it doesn't stop there. When you are at point B, alright, workers will realize, okay, so at point B, workers realize they lost their jobs. They realize inflation is only 4% because in 1 year, you are given time to check. You are given time to react. Right? You start to lower pi E. You no longer believe inflation is 5. You believe inflation now is 4. So in this case, the Phillips curve will have to shift down. Right? So this is actually your step 2. So in other words, wages will now only increase by 4%. Right? You are at point B. You lower your pi E from 5% to a 4. Meaning to say, you will only ask for wages to go up 4% already. Okay? And at point B, inflation is also 4%. So real wage, unchanged. Meaning to say, labor supply equals labor demand. U equals UN at A4. You go leftwards. This is your step 3. Right, so you're actually deploying the Phillips curve. This is not easy. That's why discussing Phillips curve I mentioned in topic 7, it's very high level. So I just want you to copy down when you study this after the prelims. Don't study it hurriedly. Study this with topic 7, Phillips curve, then study this inflation policy. So you can see, you won't stop at B. After workers adjusted their wages one round, they realized, hey, pi E is too high. They cut back the pi E, they slow down the wage increase. The firms can cope, W over P not affected already. They will hire back the workers. You reach A4. Right? Okay? So when you have a gradual policy, you give time for wages and unemployment to adjust to each other, which is good. Okay? Then when you are at A4, you continue to do the next round, because at A4, you're still not at your target yet. Your target is 3%. Right? So after you finish your step 3, this is your step 4. You cut back the inflation rate by another round. And the steps are repeated. Right? You use your contractionary policy. Firms retrench the workers. But workers over time adjust expectation. They go to A5. Alright, so there's always this zigzag that you are discussing. Right, but here, what you want to see? Where is the key focal point? The key focal point is not about the zigzag. The key focal point is each time unemployment rate only increased by 2%. Whereas, I'll flip and show you, previously it was a 4. So if you urgently want to bring down inflation rate, you are trying to say that pi E is not allowed enough time to change. It will bring a lot of harms to the workers. But if you can, reduce your inflation rate slower, you can do many rounds of installment. Here, for the purpose of simple analysis, we do 2 installments. A country can take 3 years, 4 years. So when time is allowed, workers will adjust pi E. They will not suffer from high retrenchment. In fact, given enough time, they will go back to full employment. Alright, so therefore, government has to decide if he wants to bring down inflation rate. Is it urgent? Alright, preferably it is less urgent. And it's also preferable that your UN is as small as possible. Then you want to pursue disinflation. But the choice is ultimately the hands of the government, which is the central bank, because central bank is the one who executes monetary policy. Right? So a lot of times when we read newspapers report, okay, inflation in India, inflation in Indonesia, inflation in China, you don't see every government is getting upset or nervous about it, because they know bringing down the inflation rate create more harms. They rather tolerate with it, or they believe the inflation is temporary. It will go away. Right? So in this case, tapering inflation is very costly. It adds on to your natural rate of unemployment. Okay, so hear me clearly. Study disinflation sacrifice ratio with Phillips curve on its own. Don't mix it up. You'll get very, very confused. And if you are only studying for section A, all this basic analysis is sufficient. I didn't use a single equation. Right? If I can draw the diagram, anchor well on the initial and the adjustment process, I will earn some marks. But you can tell. I mentioned a lot of times students can't do Phillips curve because the line is so simple. Yet you have to interpret every single point with respect to the firms as well as the workers. Okay, right? So with that now, let's look at page 52. Okay, so all that we keep discussing is economy has to suffer based on the sacrifice ratio. And if you see, for both cases, I assume the ratio will be constant at 2. Every time I just multiply the inflation that I want to bring down by a 2. But in reality, sacrifice ratio is actually not constant. It actually changes over time. So to be very specific, okay, you can sketch this in. Okay, putting in your axis. So I didn't make you draw because I want you to focus just on the general analysis. Okay, after the prelims, then you go back and start drawing. But in general, Phillips curve is not a straight line. In general, Phillips curve is actually convex to the origin. Okay, and you can see slope of Phillips curve is change in pi over change in u. Alright, vertical axis, horizontal axis is actually 1 over the sacrifice ratio. Because the sacrifice ratio that you calculate is how much unemployment you have to sacrifice because of the time. So they are inversely related. Okay, so if you look at your Phillips curve, if it is convex to the origin, alright, so that will actually tell us, if you go and study the slope. Okay, so we can actually observe that as pi continues to drop, you're going backwards, the slope actually drops, right? The Phillips curve gets flatter and flatter. Intuitively, the sacrifice ratio increases. Right? So the implication is, therefore, okay, if you are already at low pi, you need not further reduce the pi as sacrifice ratio is larger. So disinflation is a goal of government, but government get obsessed with this goal. Can he say inflation in Singapore is already 2%? Should we bring it lower to 0.2? You don't, because you are aware. Right? If you are already at low inflation, let's say you are at point B versus point A. If you are at point A, you seriously will bring down the pi. But if you are already at point B, you need not further reduce the pi because the trade-off is very high. Alright, you will create more unemployment, the change in the yield is larger. So that's why government is very objective. You will never set zero inflation target. Because if you want to have zero inflation target, your line is horizontal. You won't do that. Okay, just as household and workers, we want to have zero inflation. But conceptually, it's not sound. Okay, right? So this is the first critique on the sacrifice ratio. The value itself is not constant. The second critique is economic structure changes. Okay, alright? So, I'll put here for you. Okay, so if you do a quick recall, we keep saying if there's a fall in AD, right, to bring down the pi, AD must shift left, you use your contractionary policy, we say output fall. Right, and therefore labor demand drop, that's why unemployment increases. Therefore you are assuming, right, that production is a function of capital and labor is very important to you. So every time when you cut back output, right, you will use lesser labor. But if in your country, your production function uses more capital and less labor, so if AD drop, Y will definitely drop. But you don't need to retrench your workers because you already don't use workers. Right? So therefore, if you are capital intensive economy, drop in Y, but drop in LD is lesser. So although the sacrifice ratio is accurate, it could be a value of 6. But it's not relevant to your country, not relevant to all industries. Not everyone will retrench the workers when output drops. because you are capital intensive. So to slow down production, you just operate the factory at shorter hours. You can keep your workers, maybe you only have one worker operating 20 machines. You still keep that same one worker, just that you actually operate lesser machines. So labor demand drop is lesser. So the sacrifice ratio again is not accurate. Right? So in this case, right, the value is not accurate due to your economic structure changes. That over time, you switch from labor intensive to capital intensive. So this is very microeconomics. Right? But very often, we don't update the sacrifice ratio. Right? It takes us 10, 20 years to do so. But the sacrifice ratio has long changed. So the best example to illustrate this is China. Alright, it's actually China. The sacrifice ratio is no longer valid because with a short span of 3 to 5 years, right, they use lesser lowly skilled workers already. They now depend more on machines and technology. So the sacrifice ratio is no longer accurate for them. Okay, right? So this looks like a very tormenting new concept to you, okay? But it's just a value. So when you study this concept, okay, don't be dismayed by just now the curve that we saw. Right? As long as you can apply it, understanding it worsens the natural rate. Right? Okay, and this value itself is not accurate based on 2 reasons. Okay, you have enough grounding on what is called the sacrifice ratio. Okay, right, now we want to ask a very important question. So this is what the focus is. This is commonly tested in section A in the exam. So understanding what is the sacrifice ratio, it is how much unemployment will worsen. Right? So economists like to ask this question. I still like to bring my pie down. How can I occur a zero sacrifice ratio? Alright, okay, you want to propose this outcome. So zero sacrifice ratio, I'll pen it down to show you. Sacrifice ratio is change in U over change in pie, right? And therefore it tells you, right, if you want to now bring down your pie, you want to bring inflation rate down, zero sacrifice ratio will tell you change in U is 0. U will be always equals to UN. There is no retrenchment. So can this ever happen? Can the economy experience such phenomenon? And the answer is yes. But for it to happen, there must be 2 conditions. Right? There are 2 conditions you must fulfill. And it is not one of them, it must be both of them at the same time. Okay? You must be both of them at the same time. So the 2 conditions is government must be credible. It means government is trustworthy. Whatever government say, we believe. 2, we are rational. After we saw and believe government, we will react. So if you merely memorize these 2 sentences, it doesn't make sense. So we turn to page 53. I will illustrate to you. Under what circumstances government can bring down inflation rate? Yes, nobody is retrenched. Alright, okay, so let's move on to page 53. So it must follow through a series of sequencing. So step 1. Okay, so in fact this is step 1. But let's look at step 0 first. Current inflation, so let's say Singapore, right, for 2012, okay, was a 4%. So that was step 0. So government announced her inflation rate 4%, thinking that, hey, this is unbearable, right, because recession is still looming. People cannot cope. So government, step 1, announced her target, so we call it pi bar 3%. Okay, right? So in other words, government first announced, right, for the year 2013 all the way to 2016, for example. Okay, for the next 3 years, government will be committed to bring inflation only hover at 3%. And we believe. Okay, so step 2, we will believe. So in other words, we will reduce our pi E from 4%. Remember, if inflation is 4, we start to ask for wages to be 4. But now, if government say it's going to be 3, and we are rational, we react to it, we believe government, it will go down to 3%. So when government execute the policy, step 3. Okay, so step 3, we know, again we are repeating, contractionary monetary policy is to bring AD down. Okay, output will drop. So the firms cannot cope, he will cut down prices. Okay, and government can manipulate exactly to 3%. Okay, and you can see, since pi E is also 3%, so intuitively, prices increase by 3% for the next 3 years. Workers only ask for wages to go up exactly 3%. Nothing more, nothing less. Because they know government is committed to 3% inflation. Not 3.01, not 2.99, it's only 3. Then you can see W over P is unchanged. Therefore, labor demand equals labor supply. Intuitively, U equals to U. Alright, so in this case, can you have 0 sacrifice ratio? The answer is yes. You must have step 1 and step 2 to take place. Government announce, we immediately adjust. Alright, we must believe. When government say 3, we will not think that it's 3.02. Imagine if it is 3.02. Okay, so let's put at the bottom, as a note. Okay, consider if pi bar was 3%, okay, but household do not believe. Okay, they think that pi E is 3.5%. They don't believe at all. Right? They don't think it's 3. They saw COE prices, they saw shortages. Okay? They formulate pi E themselves. And then you can see, okay? This means actual inflation, price will go up 3%. Wages will increase 3.5%. So W over P will go up. Labor demand will go down. Unemployment will increase, means it's more than 10%. Right? So you can see why it is important. First, government must announce. We must be committed to reach 3. And we must believe. The moment we don't believe, we mark up to 3.5. Real wage will go up. The firms cannot cope, you will retrench the workers. Sacrifice ratio is not feasible. So sacrifice ratio is quite an interesting concept, minus the Phillips curve, which is quite distracting. If not, on its own, it's all about wage setting, price setting, labor demand. Right? So this sacrifice ratio can be 0. And in this case, you can see, okay, this is valid for no other than where you are sitting here, Singapore. Right? Government announced, we all believe it. Very, for us, which is good for us, right? But it's also sad for us because we don't check the truth. But usually, government announced policy, we all believe it. We never question it. Okay, right? But the country that is invalid, okay, would be China. Why is that so? Because the government has been trying very hard to bring down inflation rate, but it doesn't go down. So they never believe government can do it anymore. Alright, so every time government announced China's inflation will be 4%, people will say, no, I think it's 5.8. Alright, so in this case, bringing down inflation is very costly. It's very, very tough. And then another country that cannot do so was Indonesia. It's too big. When inflation cannot be readily spread. Okay, and people have distorted views based on political parties. Right? They don't believe the government, they set the wrong expectation. Of course, there's a whole list of countries we can discuss, but these are the countries plagued with inflation. Right? They found it very difficult to bring down inflation rate without a zero sacrifice ratio. Because government don't seem to be credible, right? And the people don't believe that the government can do it. Right? So this is a discussion of a zero sacrifice ratio. Okay? However, this discussion of step 0 to step 3, showing you current inflation, your target, what you do. It's a little bit overly descriptive, so a good exam answer will include the diagram. You can see up to now, I still don't use any of these equations. So I've never been intimidated by them one. I merely use the diagram. Alright, so you again, okay, start off with, of course, the lecture notes was 5 goes to 3, yeah? So step 1, okay, this is your current inflation. In fact, this is step 0. You announce, you found out your inflation is 5% first. Okay, then this is actually your step 1. You announce your goal. You're going to reach 3%. Alright, and we believe your pi E drops. This is your standard step 2. So the moment government, right, adopts the policy, we merely go from A5 to A3. So step 0, announce the current inflation rate. Step 1, announce the target. Step 2, we adapted, we believe. We ask for a slower wage increase. Right? And step 3, the moment government execute the policy, change in you is 0. Right? So make use of this diagram. And if you compare this diagram, okay, right, versus the diagram in page 50. Just put a note there. I'll put them side by side to show you. They are exactly the same diagram. Okay, so the one on the right is what you are having right now. And this is the one on the left. Okay. Both has A5, 5%. Both ended at inflation, 3%. But the one in page 50, A5 goes to B first. There was a trade-off of the sacrifice ratio. This diagram, that isn't. Because household readily adjust expectations according to pi bar. This one is, they don't. They insisted to ask for a 5% wage increase. So they still believe inflation is 5%. But workers found out that, right, firms only increase price by 3, so they will be retrenched. Right? Okay, so here you can see if workers could readily adjust their wages, okay, you have 0 sacrifice ratio. We move on, right, to the last bit. Okay, so again, evaluation. So this fairy tale ending that we saw, alright, pi E drops, W increased slower. Can it happen in reality? Again, the answer is no. Because in reality, alright, W is sticky.